Good afternoon. My name is Masego Madzonuse. I'm the CEO of the Southern Africa Trust, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series, Society Talks. And this is series number 11 that we are having since we started. And today's topic is supporting Indigenous communities in Africa amidst COVID-19. A number of our conversations have focused on the impact of COVID on marginalized populations, and we've explored marginality in different ways. We've had an opportunity to speak to a number of people or groups and their representatives who sit on the margins of our political and economic systems. And today we saw it fit to invite leaders in organizations and activists who work with Indigenous peoples throughout the African continent. We will have with us 4 speakers, renowned practitioners who themselves come from Indigenous peoples communities in various parts of Africa, joining us today. I've got with me today Lesle Jansen, who's with Natural Justice, and she's the director of the Cape Town Hub and programs director working on governance of land and natural resources. Welcome, Lesle. Lesle will, when she speaks, will tell you a bit about herself and also a bit about the organization that she represents. Also on the panel is Job Morris. Job is the founder and director of the Sena Youth Network. And Job is at the moment in Jansen, in Botswana, my home area. And it's very lovely to connect with you, Job. You're far and yet near at the same time. Job is widely experienced in development practice, and he holds human rights qualifications that have prepared him to be a good representative for his people. And like I said, he is a founder of the Sena Youth Network, and he would be able to tell us a bit more about his organization. We're waiting for one more participant. He will join us as the conversation continues, and this is Dr. Kanyinke Sena, who is the director of the Indigenous Peoples of Africa Coordinating Committee, IPACC, and Kanyinke is based in Kenya. And when he comes on board, he will also tell us about the breadth of the network and the people that he represents. In this time, it's important that we have conversations that connect us as a people, and especially in the field of civil society, it's also important that we think through how we build solidarity across sectors and across movements. And hopefully we will be listening to today's discussions with intention and looking for those opportunities where we can amplify each other's voices and identify common challenges, areas where we could collaborate better, and ultimately with the main objective of amplifying the voices of people who are otherwise invisible. And also just breaking down issues so that a lot of the challenges that we speak about and the aspirations that we have can form part of the public discourse, and they can resonate with a much wider audience outside of the organized NGOs that we work in, or our academic circles, social circles, and so forth. I'm just going to start with Lesle. And Lesle, if you could please just introduce very briefly the work that Natural Justice does. And in that process, if you could also just take us through some definitional issues and help us understand when we say Indigenous peoples, what are we talking about? Who is Indigenous in Africa and who's not? And why is it important for us to have an identifier around Indigenous peoples when we talk about some of the challenges that we're facing, the public health, economic challenges, governance challenges, and so forth. Lesle.
Okay, thanks, Masego. It's very good to be here. It's always good to work with you, and thank you for this opportunity. Yes, I'm from Natural Justice, as you said. We're basically a team of environmental lawyers specializing in environmental law and human rights law. We support communities around the issues around land and resources, and we work at different levels, local, supporting communities around different legal empowerment approaches. We also work nationally, where we look at different technical inputs around the laws to ensure that the laws reflects communities' rights and way of life. And then we also work internationally in different international processes. And so Natural Justice, we work, we've got an office in Dakar where we work as part of Francophone Africa. We've also got an office in Kenya where we're looking at supporting communities in the eastern area. And then we've got Cape Town Hub looking at the indigenous people in Southern Africa, specifically South Africa, Namibia, and Botswana. And we've been doing this work for the last 10 years. One of our key highlights for the region, Southern Africa region, is where we've just concluded, supported over 40 communities, concluding an industry-wide rooibos benefit sharing agreement where communities got a traditional knowledge levy or royalty around their first knowledge that was used to help build one of the biggest industries around in the tea sector and cosmetic sector as well. So yeah, coming to the issue of indigenous people, who is indigenous as it pertains to the issue in Africa. So the issue of indigenous people in the region, it's interesting, there's been very, very key developments in the region. Specifically, if we talk our regional mechanism, we've got the African Commission, where the African Union's human rights body, the African Commission, one of its thematic areas called the African Commission's Working Group, specifically looks at the issue of indigenous people, and they've played a key role around some of the key jurisprudence that we have around some of the Kenya communities, which I think Kanyinke can speak to some more, the Ogik and the Enderoy, where it's really seminal judgments in terms of the issue of indigenous people and their rights to land. And so the African Commission has come on board to say, confirm that in the Africa region, there are people that identify as indigenous. It confirmed that. So it's not just a global issue, it's an issue that our region faces. But I think more especially why this issue is important, because in terms of 2003, a study that they conducted, they looked at 19 countries in the Africa region, and it showed that even though we are all indigenous to Africa, within the Africa region, it is systemically showing that communities, particularly those with hunter-gatherer forms of land economies, nomadic pastoralists, are not accessing the human rights on par with other African societies. And so in terms of the human rights and in terms of the economic and social rights, they are being left behind. And so it calls on African states, on civil society, to ensure that we leave no one behind, because quite systemically it's showing that these communities are not enjoying the life that they should, as all Africans, but in particular these communities. Things such as them not being recognized. So in the national context, it's showing these communities are not existing. Their indigenous languages are not recognized. Their land rights are not recognized as a result thereof. So there's very, very real structural barriers these communities continues to face. And so we as civil society and African states, post-colonial states particularly, are called upon to look at these issues and really honestly face in the modern context, why are these communities left behind? Thanks.
I have to remember to unmute myself. Thank you, Leslie, for that introduction. I think you gave us a very useful frame and for us to understand what we mean by indigenous peoples, and most importantly, just situating it within the context of framing using African instruments, the African Commission that you spoke about, and that this is not an external label, but very much an internal one, which is dependent on how people self-identify. I like what you say about if you were to, painting the status of Indigenous peoples throughout Africa, and the issue that you raise around making sure that Indigenous peoples are not left behind. And while we give Kanyinke time to just settle down, having joined us, perhaps it's a good time to move to Job Morris. And Job, just to ask you to speak briefly about the Sena Youth Network. And we have seen you actively raising awareness and bringing attention to the plight of Indigenous peoples in the context of COVID. So if you could introduce the network, but also just take us into your insights on what the impact has been on minority and Indigenous communities in the continent or where you are based.
Thank you, Masero. Yeah, my name is Job Morris. I'm from Jansen and in a village called Dikar. It's about 35 kilometers off of Jansen. It's an area situated with where majority of the San people are, not really majority, but majority of the Naro San speakers. And what we do mostly in Sena Youth Network is to try to impact, especially on the using the voice of the youth to impact various development agendas. The Sena Youth Network is an organization that was started, conceptualized in 2011, but really became active in 2013 when we tried to define what the objectives of the Sena Youth Network would be. 2017, it became registered and just opened its office this year. So Sena Youth Network basically is an organization working towards the needs of the youth, the San youth, in different development perspectives, including health, culture, Indigenous peoples movements, and advocating for the rights of the San youth, and giving access to the San youth to different services that government itself and other stakeholders offering. We have been active in the Sena Youth Network in trying to mitigating the COVID-19 by donating in different donations to the San people here in Dakar. But it has been very hard because of different circumstances to actually meet the target of having to spread our wings elsewhere to also benefit the San who are living in other communities. But we have been active in different programs in response to COVID-19. One of them was to also give relevant messages, updated messages about the COVID-19 in the local languages, in the local language that they understand themselves. So it has been a little bit an improvement in that sector, and us contributing to the COVID-19 mitigating strategy within our community. Because community members living together, a society living together, when COVID-19 breaks out, it will be devastating to the indigenous communities in Dakar. Thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you, Job. I'm going to just ask you a follow-up question before I move on to Kanyinke, because I think it's important that you help people understand. Botswana was one of the countries that took very swift action around COVID-19, and as a result, the spread is not as wide as we're seeing in neighboring countries. So within a context of a country that seemingly did the right thing at the right time, what do you mean when you say there's a risk of COVID-19, having devastating effects on indigenous peoples? And why is it important for you to be running the programs that you are running, the education programs that you are running, the donation programs that you are running, and the outreach program that you are running? Is the government not doing enough?
First off, to answer the COVID-19 issue, there is a risk of spread because we don't know who is passing from Gaborone, because Gaborone is a central place where we are now seeing high numbers of COVID-19 infections. Yes, there's quite a low number, but there is a risk of spread in case someone's traveling from Gaborone to our areas, or someone from here in Jansen traveling to Gaborone.
Mm-hmm.
To get that, to be infected by that virus is a risk of spreading that disease actually in Jansen. And it spreads so fast that if there are some cases, it will be devastating to communities, especially in Dakar, where we notice poor communities in one house living, 11 people living or staying together in only one house. So that is actually, it will be devastating in that case, and will very much spread fast if we have that experience. And yeah, it has been a lot of improvement on the government to see that services are delivered. Some of the services are to hand out or donate food hampers or food baskets to community members, but those efforts are quite limited. And households, people living in one house, 11 people living in one house, just such small amounts of food hampers cannot really satisfy them. So what we do is to contribute to the efforts that are already in place, noticing that the government cannot do all of these things alone. So we have the heart of driving these initiatives to our people to make sure that they are safe. And we understand also that there is limited resources coming, and there has been also risk of spreading of the COVID-19. So we make sure that we have to be prepared. And what we do is try to donate as much as we can with as little as we have. Thank you.
This muting and unmuting business is hard. Thank you, Job. I think this is a perfect time to bring in Kanyinke Sena. Kanyinke, I introduced you in absentia, and I'm glad we could connect. Perhaps as a way of introducing yourself, you could also speak about the work that IPACC does, so our participants have an understanding of the network and its extent and its reach. And maybe you can also, seeing that IPACC covers the entire continent, your membership covers the entire continent, you possibly have a bird's eye view and would be able to bring us into a better understanding of what the impact of COVID has been on Indigenous peoples in the African continent.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be part of this very important discussion. I'm sorry I'm a bit late. Sometimes traveling in the territories you operate is quite difficult because we don't stay in the cities, so you might estimate that you'll reach somewhere in 20 minutes, but you take an hour. But I'm glad that I'm a few minutes later and I'm here. And they say it's better late than never. So just to talk a bit about the IPACC, IPACC actually represents the story of indigenous peoples in Africa, in the sense that when we go back to how the whole idea of the whole history of indigeneity, from the doctrine of discovery, long time before 500 years ago, with the voyages of discovery and etc., to the time that actually the first member of a community visited the United Nations, the League of Nations, then in 1920, to demand that they also wanted to be on the table, because how could the big nations, the big tribes, the British, the French, the Spanish, be speaking without including the other tribes, and when we are supposed to be the United Nations? So, but actually, by the time the whole idea then of indigenous peoples got into the table in the early 80s, it only focused initially on the native tribes of America, Latin America, New Zealand, and Australia, until around 1988, when actually the first Africans now who are similarly situated with those tribes that were participating in the United Nations started participating in that system. So, and this was Parkipunya Masai, actually from Tanzania, who was the first African to participate in the indigenous movement. And from that participation in 1998, from 1988, then various communities, primarily pastoralists, started also attending UN meeting in Geneva, and then they were joined by hunter-gatherer communities. These communities who live deep in the forest, and of course the people in the deserts, like the community that Job represents, the Khoisan. So around 1995, 96, they started discussing the idea of forming a network to push their agenda in the continent. And that actually led to the birth of IPACC in 1997, and it was being supported by lawyers from South Africa. And that's how then it ended up being registered in South Africa as a network of indigenous peoples, but it's registered under South African law. So IPACC does several things. First of all, its main goal is to promote the rights of indigenous peoples in Africa. That's a very big mandate, because when you talk about human rights, it touches everything. First, land rights, rights to food, children rights, women rights, elderly rights, everything is there. But because we are a network, then we can have voices heard in all those spaces. So currently, IPACC has about 135 member organizations in 22 countries across the continent, from North America, West Africa, Central Africa, East Africa, and of course, Southern Africa. I'm the director currently, and our head office in Cape Town. So as I say, we work on promoting indigenous rights in the continent. Primarily, we have been focusing on environment and climate change, realizing that it's easier when you talk about land through the environment framework, rather than just confronting governments. You know how difficult African governments can be sometimes. But when we talk about the environment, okay, how do we protect this forest? Then they can listen, and then from that, then we go, but who owns this forest then, so that we can discuss the whole idea of protection. So the whole idea of human rights gets in. In places like Central Africa, we do an early warning system because of the conflicts that are there, whereby we have a partnership between the indigenous peoples, NGOs working there, and the UN agencies to warn them when indigenous people see signs of war. We also do work around World Heritage Sites. Currently, we are the focal point of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on World Heritage, and one of the key achievements we had there last year was to influence the review of guidelines by the World Heritage Committee to include indigenous people's rights in every stage of the process, from the inscription, nomination, management, and of course, monitoring. So we also have a women rights program. We are trying to strengthen the voices of indigenous women. As you know, when you look at the whole idea of indigenous people, and as Lesle said, from the 2003 report by the African Commission Working Group on Indigenous Populations that was adopted by the African Union, you see that the whole idea centers around marginalization of these communities. So when you look at indigenous people and the places they're the most excluded, they're the most marginalized, they have no services, they're very poor, they're just pastoralists moving from maybe one place to another, they don't care whether this is a national boundary or not. Hunter-gatherers also operating within the Congo Forest Framework, for example, don't care whether they're in Gabon now or Cameroon or wherever, they're just leading their lives. So one of the things that COVID has done is, when COVID first came to Africa, the first case was announced in Africa on 14th February 2020, the Valentine's Day. Of course, it was the worst news that Africa received on a Valentine's Day ever since that idea of Valentine was introduced into the continent. African government started putting in place measures. But then some acted quick enough, others waited a bit, others were in very complex situations. For example, like Kenya, which is a transit point of goods going to Uganda, DRC, Burundi, Rwanda, so they couldn't close up things quickly. But then now when the first cases were announced in Kenya, for example, where I stay, government, the responses included curfews, included lockdowns of the border so that we couldn't get movements from Tanzania into Kenya, and then other measures. But when we look at the impact of these measures, first of all, the lockdowns and movement restrictions helped in the sense that the whole COVID-19 could not spread faster into the villages, because now first people are restricted from coming to the villages and vice versa. But these measures also had a reverse impact in the sense that indigenous people's livelihoods, for example, in the Kenyan-Tanzanian border, pastoralists grazing, when the borders were closed, pastoralists could not move now to either to Tanzania or Kenya to graze their animals. When we look at the Sahel region, that's Chad, the area around Chad, Central Africa Republic, and etc., the whole idea of transhumance pastoralists, where these pastoralists cover large distances, thousands of kilometers in a grazing pattern because of the circumstances within that region. When this grazing pattern was interrupted by the response measures against COVID-19, a lot of issues came about. The livestock died because they couldn't access grass and water. This brought in new diseases. People died. People suffered hunger, and etc. But we also see that with that continued spread, of course, I'll discuss the whole idea of livelihoods. There was also panic buying of food in the cities. So essential foods that are not available in the villages could not reach villages in the city. And the whole message that came initially was it's doomsday. So when we buy everything, stock up for months. So indigenous people don't have fridges and stores to store their food. So that was a big problem for them. And of course, with the curfew, with the restrictions of movement, the worst impact was police brutality that accompanied that order, because police took that to mean that whenever you see anybody walking, you just beat them up thoroughly so that they could go back to where they came from. So it resulted in a lot of human rights abuses. But then we also note that at all these stages of the COVID-19 process, right from when the first case was declared up to date, there's a critical information gap, because the information is not reaching indigenous peoples in ways that they understand, because mostly it's on TVs and radios, which are not found in the indigenous peoples. And the few indigenous people who have phones in their villages, where most of the information we see through social media is mostly not very accurate. So there's a lot of misinformation. So the other response measure by African government that has impacted indigenous peoples across the continent is the closure of schools. So this directly has an impact on the right to access information. So we see that in many countries, the whole idea of online teaching was discussed, but that is not practical in indigenous territories where people are moving constantly, number one. Number two, they don't have electricity, and of course, they don't have computers. Over the last week, I visited a few communities in Kenya, and I saw that at one point from 2017, 18, the government distributed tablets to about 40 tablets each for about 10 schools deep in indigenous people's territories. But believe you me, from 2017, those tablets are still remaining in store. They have never been opened because of, one, the teachers don't know how to use them. Two, there's no power. Three, they think that these are strange things that can bring other things to the community. So they're very careful on how they handle that. So you see, so the whole idea of access to information remains a big challenge. But when we look at also one other impact that is currently emerging is the impact of COVID-19 on indigenous women in particular. We find that it's hardening their burden in the sense that They're the main providers. Normally when kids, mostly when kids go to school in Kenya and in most African countries, kids go to boarding school. So when the parents pay school fees and governments also contribute, so in 3 months, the government helps in feeding the children. But now that the children are home all the time, it increases the burden for the women to get the basic things. And that becomes a challenge, especially when markets are closed. So the men cannot sell their livestock, the women cannot sell milk, and etc. But now, lastly, because I don't want to take a lot of time, is the issue that has emerged, and that's the issue of teenage pregnancies. In the villages I visited, people are saying that out of maybe 20 girls, only 2 may go back to school without being pregnant during this COVID period. And those are teenage girls, so girls who are in the upper levels of primary school and in secondary school. So this is a big issue that is emerging. And now with the school reopening having been pushed to January, it means that there will be the level of pregnancy, almost every girl will get pregnant. So the government, several African governments have started trying to put in place measures to address these issues, including the high prevalence rates of domestic violence now when during the COVID period, because now the husbands are staying at home most of the time. That's something that many of them are not used to, because African men and especially indigenous men are mobile most of the time. So when you restrict them to a place, they're under a lot of pressure. So, and that turns into violence into their home. So the several governments are putting in place strategies to start addressing gender-based violence at home, including teenage pregnancies. So let me stop there for now.
Thank you, Kanyinke, and I mean, very comprehensive in your assessment of what the challenges are. And I quite like how you were also able to explain that when we're talking about marginalization of indigenous peoples, there's a number of things that at play, being marginalized because of who they are, and on the basis of cultural marginalization that you're facing, but also marginalized in terms of where they are, where indigenous peoples are located. And you talk about the location in remote areas, in areas that are considered to be remote, but also far away from public services, health services, education services, but also just the impracticality around how we think of the provision of public services, that these are designed for sedentary lifestyles. And in this case, we're talking about a group of families and communities whose lifestyles are nomadic by nature, and meaning that there needs to be some adaptation in how public services are delivered. A lot of the examples you gave are around pastoral indigenous peoples. And now I'm wondering if either Leslie or Job would like to just paint the picture for us on what the plight of indigenous peoples in Southern Africa face, and particularly those who come from hunter-gatherer communities or with hunter-gatherer backgrounds. And then we will open up for questions from our participants. Please feel free to use the chat on the YouTube channel to post your comments there, your questions, and we'll weave them into the discussion and try and get the panelists to respond as much as possible. Leslie, would you like to go first?
Yeah, thanks, Mashego. I think Job is, I think you would be able to add a lot, but I would maybe just want to come in on on something conceptual and just on the rights issue. In terms of these issues that Kanyinke has mentioned, there's one key issue in this, the fact that communities in Southern Africa, indigenous communities in Southern Africa, in the region, all are facing these challenges, are facing these issues, yeah? But there's something particular about indigenous people's challenges. The fact that they are facing these structural challenges. the fact that they're not recognized, one example, is the fact that it makes it difficult for the government to understand how to consult, who to consult, how were they organized. A lot of their voices have gone amiss in terms of the disaster relief, for instance, because your recognized communities and their leadership structures, for instance, would be consulted, and the communities were left out in that regard. Yeah. And then there's the geographical isolation, where a lot of the developmental and relief measures are conceptualized from the capital, far away from where these communities are. And so I just want to come back to the point of special measures. And that's why it is important to go over and above whatever the relief and developmental approaches are, to see what and understand nationally what is that obligation of special measures to ensure, again, that no one is left behind. And it's just been in the context of these issues, particularly in Southern Africa, key for these communities to ensure that they are also included when, disaster relief efforts are put up. How are they not also accessed, understood? How are their voices included? Because the essence still remains consultation, participation, people being able to give consent. But how could they give that, meaningfully, if they are not even recognized, and it's not even easy to consult them, to access them in terms of their leadership, and to understand how are they organized. And so just that is a point that I just wanted to just add. Thanks.
Thanks, Leslie. Job, would you like to come in?
Yes, thank you, Masejo, and thank you, Kanyinke and Lesle. I think the problem that we have, especially during the COVID-19, during that time of the restrictions of movement and what the government has seen fit to implement to try to curb the spread of the virus, we have seen a number of things that happen. First of all, on the education sector, the young people are taken back home. Now they're sitting around, they're doing nothing, and there is an issue for them now to study at home. And many of the indigenous people, especially here, they don't have access to internet. They don't have access to online education platforms where they can train. So it becomes difficult for them to actually train or educate themselves online at this time of COVID-19. So that actually brings back the issue of girl child, especially those that are in secondary education, to not having to do anything at that point, fall pregnant. So they don't have any activities, they don't have anything to keep them busy. So it becomes a problem. For those young boys who actually indulged in such activities, also become uh, uh, they, they 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 become stressed so much and have so much pressure in what to do and what not to do, and some of the issues of violence also come to play. We have experienced and have seen some of the gender-based violence perpetrated by men to women, and it has been very difficult, especially on the restrictions of movement, on how the woman can actually go and report these cases to the police. So this actually things come into play, and especially on the on Sena women who have do not have actually a good way of communication in Tswana or English. For them to go to court or into the police to report this becomes really hard for them because they don't know how to communicate these issues. Some of the issues are also those that of communities getting hungry, people getting hungry because of the fact that some of them may have been entrenched at work. They don't have work to do. They are not earning anything to sustain themselves. So now, because of hunger, they get to hunt. So, as a culture of hunting communities, when they get caught, it's a problem. They call it poaching. The San people call it hunting. So then that now becomes a problem, and they get arrested. But the purpose of hunting is for them to actually provide to the family members and not doing anything else other than that. So there's a counterplay of different activities during especially the COVID-19. While I understand why the restrictions were done, there are also other implications, especially that disadvantage the indigenous communities who already have been marginalized, who already are poor. So these issues actually become a problem for the indigenous communities and other organizations that are working to service indigenous people specifically um, do not have such services and funding to do so. Becomes really a problem to do outreach activities. Thank you.
Both Job and Leslie, you've provided some really thought-provoking insights there. Before I ask my next question, because I'd like us to use the remaining 20 minutes to move towards what do solutions look like. I'd like to just read one of the comments that comes from our participants, and we have a comment here from Denver, who says that the challenge that institutions will have to ensure that they remain engaged with the First Nation communities, who very often are not consulted or informed about the issues. And I think he speaks to what all of you have highlighted, that around access to information, but just also consultation. Going back to what Leslie was saying, and all of you have mentioned this, you know, how do you get consulted when in the first place you're not even recognized, and your structures are not even recognized. So the question that I have for you is what is needed? What are the responses and strategies that are needed to address and respond to what Leslie referred to as special measures? What do those special measures look like? What is it that can be done to address the plight of Indigenous peoples as you have highlighted? And also, how can regional organizations, NGOs, even national NGOs that work in the development and human rights sector be of assistance? Yeah, I'll stop with those questions, and then I'm going to read another question that has come from the participants. Kanyinke, perhaps we can start with you on what are those special measures that are required just to address some of the issues that you raised. You raised issues around access to information. How do we fix that? Access to public services, the education that you spoke about, and just taking care of the well-being of Indigenous peoples, and also just the national responses that you spoke about. You brought in a very interesting dimension around national lockdowns and restrictions of movements, particularly border closures, and how disruptive that has been to the livelihoods of nomadic pastoralists in some parts of the continent. Kanyinke? You're on mute.
Okay, so thank you so much. First of all is to discuss the issue of access to information. We as IPACC, what we're trying to do now is we're trying to condense the information on COVID and translating it into indigenous languages and sharing it to among communities. So, and that's one thing that I've seen other organizations to do, but that's what we have done as IPACC, and we might need to think of how to take that further forward so that communities can have more information of COVID-19, because in some villages, when you visit them, they tell you COVID is a disease of the cities. It's not us, it's only in the cities and China. So, but now, with the African governments grappling with the issue of do they open the economies or not, many are choosing to open the economies. And when opening the Kenyan economy, for example, what the Minister of Health said is that, well, we are opening the economy, but now you are on your own. Take care of yourself with COVID-19, take care of your family, the government. We don't have the resources, we don't have the capacity to reach every corner of this country. So when we look at that statement, again, as the background that, well, in the villages, there's not much information about COVID-19. In the villages that I visited, people are not wearing masks because of the disease of the city. There are no hand washing facilities available, public. And in fact, in situations where there's access to water challenges, that also complicates things further. Two, there are no medical facilities to hospital beds, because many of them don't even have medical facilities. So there's a need then for organizations to support some of these measures in communities, simply just providing water tanks that communities can fetch water, put one tank in a public place that all people can access and wash their hands. Providing masks, they are cheaper. So that will save a lot of community lives. And one thing that I need to bring to the fore is the issue that in indigenous communities, upper respiratory tract diseases are rampant, either because they live in very cold areas in the forest or in very dusty areas in the sense of the Kalahari and the Sahara deserts. So when COVID then finally goes into these villages, the impacts will be devastating. And that's why we think that, well, there'll be need then for us to move urgently to start putting these things in place. Secondly, is the livelihoods approach that will be needed, because at the end of the day, people must eat, people must take care of their families. So I think we need to sit down and design together systems that will ensure that indigenous livelihoods continue. Maurice has spoken about hunting and gathering. Hunting and gathering it has been criminalized in all countries in Africa. But you see, this was a strategy for indigenous people to provide not only food for themselves, but protein, which goes to addressing the right to health of these communities. So that's a discussion that we also need to review, especially with the conservation NGOs, because they are powerful, they have a lot of money, and governments listen to them, but it's the same conservation NGOs that are pushing that idea of fortress conservation. Like right now, as you're speaking, part of the reason why I delayed is because I'm in the Mau forest and the Ogiek are being evicted from Mau forest. So where will these people go? You know, as much as the government sees how difficult the situation is now, it's still taking some measures that are not pro-health, are not pro-education of these indigenous communities. So the issue of border closures has actually been a challenge in Africa, because we still live in that mindset where every country wants to lock itself in. In fact, that's why you see even the implementation of the African Agenda 2063 and some of the things that it envisioned is not going as fast, because there's suspicion between countries. But indigenous people have been moving across these boundaries for centuries. In fact, they were divided by boundaries which were not there before. So what I would advise is you help us at the regional level, the SADC, East African region, East African community, ECOWAS, and etc. We go back and look at the Sami model, where the Sami travel across the countries that they neighbor, and they're not interfering with anybody. Why can pastoralists in Africa be allowed to do that? Why can the hunter-gatherers in the Congo Basin be allowed to go freely to DRC, Cameroon, Gabon, etc., and do the thing? So there's a need for policy. But as Leslie said, if you are not recognized, how can you be part of how can you be part of the discussion if people don't recognize you? So first thing is that will be necessary is that aspect of recognition. And of course, NGOs, the human rights organizations should actually start helping us collect disaggregated data, so that when COVID goes there, we start understanding how many people are impacted by COVID-19. Obviously, food will be a major challenge going forward. So the whole aspect of food security will be a very important topic to actually partner on. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanyinke, and Job, and then Leslie.
Thank you, Masejo. I think, as Kanyike is saying, the issue is also recognition and also trying to see the existence of certain issues on the certain specific groups of individuals or groups of people, as such as the indigenous peoples. Africa, most of Africa goes a long way into not recognizing the term indigenous, and also even people that are indigenous are not quite recognized as so and to be awarded such rights. So it becomes difficult actually in Botswana. It's very difficult to express yourself in your own tongue because there are only two official languages that are being recognized, and we have a problem, most of us, to actually express ourselves in detail in a language we don't really understand. So having those things in place to recognize actually the existence of different languages, so as people can be free as much as possible to express themselves, is quite, I think, an agenda that most of the African countries can adopt, and to have actually some kind of a response strategy to indigenous communities, and especially geared on the issues of COVID-19. So it has been a problem for us as people of indigenous stature living especially in the villages. So one thing that I would actually also advise different institutions is to have, especially during this plight of the pandemic, that we should be partnering and have to reduce the restrictions of how partnership should be. Because if we still have such restrictions and requirements that are so high, uh, certain NGOs or civil societies may not have the ability or kind of the capacity to partner in order to respond to certain uh, uh, kind of emergent activities that they want to do. So it becomes a difficult situation when the requirements of partnership in order to deliver certain services to mitigate the pandemic is required. It's really something that we need to push forward, and those institutions should actually relax themselves and try to see a way forward into that. Thank you, Marcelo.
Thank you, Job. I think many of us on the call and in this panel can identify with what you've just said around the architecture of fund and aid to support the work that social movements and civil society organizations do. Leslie?
Yeah, in terms of recommendations, Mashego, I think it will be three core recommendations from my side. I think the first would be on your question of special measures. What does it look like? There's universally accepted global standards, which the African Commission, through jurisprudence, has brought into the regional system. And it's called the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Again, it doesn't give special rights. It just guides how special rights, sorry, it doesn't give any special rights. It guides how special measures, namely the implementation of these rights, should be applied in the national context. So within the context of health and safety, of COVID, bearing in mind, what it needs to keep people safe, those rights more so now should be applied and respected. And indigenous people's rights is also human rights. It's the same human rights as it is for everyone else. but there's an obligation to, with the complexities of these communities, take cognizance of these special measures that is needed. The second recommendation would be for, if I take South Africa, where we have a massively strong civil society, it is key that we also put all of the weight behind also advocating for the rights of these communities. And again, it doesn't have to detract from any other struggle in South Africa. It is just ensuring that we also give our weight, our resources, our thinking to the rights and the struggles of these communities, who many a times are delivering key services to the environment, looking after our wildlife, servicing our national parks, making sure that our biodiversity is looked after, is sustained for the future generations. So it's in many cases a key service they're delivering to our environment. So we all should be invested, given our planetary crisis, that we support these struggles as well. We're in a key time now with Black Lives Matter. They've brought the struggle of peoples to a point few have seen so far. So we can just win to add the struggle as well to it. And I think that kind of encapsulates my third recommendation as well. Thanks, Mashego.
Thank you, Leslie. I mean, that's quite powerful. I think connecting it also to the broader issue around the Black Lives Matter movement, and both Job and Kanyinke in outlining why Indigenous people's rights matter in this context talked about almost the racism within conservation, and also within how resources are accessed and distributed, even by our post-independent governments. I think that really brings to the attention that when we're talking about marginalization, there is layers of marginalization that tends to happen, and there's a layer that we generally don't pay attention to, and this is the layer of Indigenous peoples. I like what you also began to talk about when you're talking about the contribution that Indigenous peoples make to society and to at a global level, just in terms of being custodians of biodiversity and habitats that are almost the last frontiers of where the hope for humanity and rebalancing our planetary boundaries lies. And in the current search for the cure for COVID, or even understanding the COVID pandemic and its links with human well-being and ecosystem well-being, there is no better worldview to look at than to look at the worldview and the understanding that Indigenous peoples have. There's one last question from one of our participants, and as you respond to that, I'd like you to just share your parting words in terms of the one thing that you see and envision as we are rethinking the future of development in the continent, and what a post-COVID world looks like in the context of Indigenous peoples. And the question is, it comes from Lee. Lee says his concern remains with the preservation of culture and language, considering that Indigenous peoples' numbers are already at risk. And are there any interventions in place to mitigate this? This is to mitigate the loss of language. And when we connect the importance of language in the Indigenous context, is in language also comes a library of knowledge around the very same Indigenous knowledge systems that we're looking to for cures within the health sector, that we're looking to for responses to the multiple crises that we're seeing in the health sector. There's more questions on the chat. I encourage you to read those questions, and as you are wrapping up, see if you can respond. Respond to that. I will start with. I'm going to start with Job, and then I'll go to Leslie and end with Kanyinke.
Thank you, Masego.
Yes.
Yes. In Botswana, it is quite difficult when we talk about language because there is no promotion of mother tongue. Civil societies have had a good fight into trying to advocate for mother tongue policy to be implemented, or for any of such thing of the resemblance to be, but it has never really taken form. So it has been a difficult situation, and especially now that we are in COVID-19, the government has did whatever it could do to spread the languages of using different languages to spread the message on COVID-19. But now that COVID-19, perhaps things are getting relaxed, that actually comes to stop in the national television. It doesn't happen anymore. So it becomes a problem. And also promoting languages for the indigenous peoples is not something that Botswana would like to talk about. And civil societies that promote such activities do not go any further because of actually the limitations, considering there's no support from institutions that would otherwise build these activities. And when we talk about, I see in a comment talking about Kalahari, the number of HIV, TB are very high. It's true. And especially TB, actually, we have a high number of TB infections in Kalahari. And here in Botswana, in Jansen, we have higher rates of TB prevalence rates also because of poor structures. Community members or people stay together in one house. There is a high spread number of the rate of spreading of TB is quite high, and it's really a concern. HIV, yeah, it is a concern that we also need to look into, but the TB is really high, and something needs to be done. Thank you.
Mashego, from my side, my closing words would be, I don't have any pearls of wisdom at the stage, but I think I would want to say something about the community of the Kalahari that is mentioned as an example. We've just received a complaint where communities wanted to go hunting and they are facing criminalization, as Kanyinke mentioned earlier. Because of the situation of COVID, they are experiencing extreme hunger. Initiative has been taken. People actually went hunting, and they are now facing criminalization as a result of actual criminal charges. I'm not going to give more detail, but it is an opportunity, I think, for civil society, for instance, in South Africa, to start being involved. Those communities are struggling with issues of water. They host the most ancient language in South Africa that's near extinct. There's elders that are, that are custodians and stewards of languages, of biodiversity, of wildlife. People so deeply connected with that area. I want to call on IPACC. I want to call on Southern Africa Trust to look at what is happening there, gift support. Kalahari is so far, it's geographically isolated. Whilst there's been key strides, there's also key challenges. So that's really the areas where we should be giving our weight as an example of what I've been trying to say so far. But then again, I also think it's a key moment in time. And if we can draw from what this moment needs of us, hopefully we can use Indigenous people and their legacy and who they are to help get us out of this mess that we're in right now. But thank you.
Over to you, Kanyinke. You're still on mute.
Yeah, I'm unmuted. Thank you. So my last comments actually, let me try to very quickly run through some of the ideas that I have. Of course, I have to start with the whole idea of culture. Everybody loves indigenous cultures, and you can see that with how they market, how almost every African country markets its tourism industry. come and visit Kenya, we have the Maasai, come and visit South Africa, we have the San, etc. But then again, and then every country, every constitution recognizes culture, and then we have laws of culture in every country. The problem is implementation of that to make sure that those cultures are robust and continue to thrive, given that also that cultures are not static. So one of the strategies would be to look at culture not specifically from the tourism perspective and the cultural heritage perspective that UNESCO pushes, but also to look at it, culture from the intellectual property rights that the World Intellectual Property runs. Of course, they are trying now to come with a law on traditional knowledge, with the also African Regional Intellectual Property Rights Organization, ARIPO. These are the spaces that we could engage. And now that we are talking about culture, we also have to talk about traditional knowledge. With COVID-19, we see many communities now going back to their traditional medicines. When you go to every village, they tell you, oh, we have those respiratory medicines that we use to keep COVID at bay. When you look at some of the pictures I post on Facebook, they boil 50 different types of herbs as a strategy to start protecting themselves against COVID. But how recognized are these medicines? How what are the support that governments can give to these structures? So talking about traditional knowledge, we see the whole discussion within the context of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the post-2020 development agenda. So this is an area that we could also start engaging in strongly. But most importantly, also in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, they have a whole thing on local communities and indigenous peoples platform that is focusing on how to address traditional knowledge and climate change adaptation and mitigation. And finally, cultures and languages go hand in hand. Last year, if my memory serves me well, was the International Year of Indigenous Languages declared by the United Nations to save languages. And I think they declared a decade of indigenous languages. So that is a framework that we can engage in. Africa, the African Union has a structure to promote languages, which is it's called ACALAN, but I don't see it strongly engaging on the preservation of indigenous languages. And that I think is a discussion that we need to have. So let me stop there and thank you.
Thank you to all of you. I mean, it's so difficult to stop the discussion because there's so much richness that is coming through. I almost feel like we need a follow-up conversation because there's so much that you sort of touched on and would need us to unpack a little bit further. But I really appreciate that you joined us and were able to share your insights as part of a broader, wider public education exercise, but also an exercise of building solidarity across movements, as I said, from the beginning. And you've given very practical ideas around if people were looking to step up and show up for Indigenous peoples communities in this time, where is the support needed? You've talked about the importance of access to education and appropriate access to information and appropriate information in local languages, but also just thinking through how we resolve some of those technology challenges that are being a hindrance. You've talked about making essential services available to Indigenous peoples, understanding that a lot of them are in geographically isolated places. So how do we make it possible for the masks and all of the health interventions that are being proposed, and how do we make it possible for them to reach these communities? I liked what you said about the importance of taking a livelihoods approach to the COVID responses in the disaster moment, but also thinking about what this means in the recovery period. And that perhaps is also even an opportunity to resolve some old questions and issues that were there before. And this is around recognizing cultural diversity and within Indigenous peoples, questions around recognizing language rights and the structures and Indigenous peoples as a people, making provisions for seasonal mobility across borders, because the border closures has had devastating impacts on nomadic groups. But there was also something that you said about the right to food, and how we think about that in the context where the livelihood strategies of Indigenous peoples are largely criminalized. So in a time when people are losing jobs, don't have access to income, are missing out on the school feeding programs, and they're really needing to feed their families, and they're hunter-gatherers, is it right for hunting to be perceived as poaching? Or is there a way in which conservation and the livelihoods of Indigenous peoples can coexist? And the challenge that you threw out to the broader civil society movement to join efforts with Indigenous peoples organizations, and like you said, support, but also look at ways where we can lend solidarity and access to resources and so forth. With that summary, I'd love to thank you very much for joining us. Thanks to the panelists and to your interesting comments and questions that you shared with us. This was a very enriching discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.